Hello, everyone. We are back for another session. Coca in the Andes between eradication and regulation. My name is Ariel Clark. I am an attorney and an activist. I'm co-general legal counsel to Chacruna. I am co-founder of Clark Howell. We are a law firm doing work in the psychedelics, cannabis, and hemp space. And I'm really excited that we will have Diego join us here in a minute. So glad everyone has joined us for this discussion. I hope everyone has had a great conference. Really have. I'll just put in a plug to the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative that Chacruna unveiled yesterday. It's a really beautiful initiative. I hope everyone checks it out. I'll drop more information in the chat. Oh, here we have so many helpful people. It's wonderful. Behind the scenes, beautiful kindness. Yeah, and it's been a really, really interesting discussions and great day. So we will have the discussion, the presentation from Diego, and then in the meanwhile, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And we'd also in the chat love to hear where you're from and all the things. Here we have Diego. Wonderful. So Diego, I'm going to introduce you briefly, and then I'll step away and come back for the Q&A. So Diego Garcia-Devis is a Colombian political scientist with 15 years experience analyzing, mediating, and monitoring the Colombian socio-political armed conflict. In 2008, Diego was awarded by the UK Foreign Office to undertake a postgraduate studies at the War Studies Development at King's College of London. As an expert on peace building and human rights, Diego has worked for the Organization of American States and USAID, managing and coordinating projects in areas such as disarmament, demobilization, reintegration of combatants, prevention of forced recruitment of children, and protection of human rights. He has also conducted extensive research on issues such as the relationship between violence, narco-trafficking, and socio-political conflict. Diego is now a global drug policy program officer at OSF, overseeing the program's portfolio in the Latin American region. So we are so excited to hear your presentation. So nice to see you, and I'll see you in a while.
Yeah, thank you very much, and apologies for being somehow late. Hoping is not necessarily an easy platform to navigate, although we practiced, rehearsed, and made our test, but here we are. Thank you everyone for connecting, for taking time to bring a different sort of perspective and approach to Coca in Los Andes, and to what I think is a binary, wrongly approach to the plan. But before start, let me thank Via, Karen, and the rest of the Chacruna team for organizing the second conference on sacred plants. I was able to participate in the first iteration of the conference, and there's no doubt that this is a unique space that challenges traditional thinking, and that's what I pretend to do. I pretend to bring a perspective on a sacred plant, the Coca plant, that is somehow a center or core of my work in the Andean region. And I think this conference has always facilitated a dialogue between many disciplines, at times that seem strange to each other. And my intention today is to offer some reflections, trying to connect the Coca plant as a sacred plant and drug policy reform, which are two different approaches to the issue. And I pretend to do it by bringing your attention to a crossroad where the Coca plant is sitting today, and this is one which involves criminal policy, rural development, cultural and indigenous rights, regulation and industrialization of plants and substances as well. Most of my observations will be made from as I said, from the drug policy perspective. This is the policy facet aimed at suppressing the cocaine market at its source, which I will argue that is the origin of most of the phenomena that we live today in the Andean region related to coca cultivation, and even has manifestations in Mexico through the current levels of violence that we see in the media. We all know that the coca plant is sacred. We have read and heard of the works of Anthony Henman, Wade Davis, their explorations and their extensive work on the coca plant and their uses. We also know today that there are traces of coca chewing in the Andean region that can go back to at least 3,000 years ago, and is still used by many indigenous peoples in the region. As well, it's been sort of increasingly used by mestizo populations. Mama Coca, one of the most prominent works from Anthony Henman, reflects on the fact that only until 1860, cocaine was isolated from the coca plant in Germany by Albert Niemann. But this is not the breaking point of the challenges that the coca plant is facing today. I will argue, and I'll try to define, for the sake of the discussion, that the origin of the current phenomena is located in the efforts to reduce the supply of cocaine. Policies that are sort of placing the first dilemma on the coca plant and its farms, and that has a date, 1961, when the United Nations Single Conventions on Narcotic Drugs was signed, and stipulated that coca should be eradicated, with the premise or the idea that by reducing the supply of coca, the cocaine market will be sort of banished over a few decades. That convention as well sort of established that the abolishing of coca chewing, a traditional use of coca for centuries, within a period of 25 years. So in 1961, they established that by 1986, coca chewing was going to be eradicated. So let me refer to that and come back to that idea that is quite problematic later. This prohibitionist approach was based on the assumption, again, that the existing global market of cocaine could be terminated by attacking, literally eradicating the supply. The premise was simple to them. By eradicating, reducing the raw material, coca, to produce cocaine, prices will increase. Therefore, users won't be able to afford it, to pay cocaine, and demand will decrease. Today, we see still an increased use of cocaine, not only in the US and Europe, but as well in other countries, transit countries of cocaine like Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Mexico, and others. In order to obey the UN mandate, the implementation of supply reduction policies involving or including investment from global north countries, it's characterized by two main sort of elements, sort of following the Monroe Doctrine: the confrontational approach, which I will call the stick, and the development sort of approach, the carrot. The confrontational approach is based basically on integrating the security apparatus, the military and the police sectors, to control policies mainly supported by the US. We all have heard about the Plan Colombia, the investments of DA in Bolivia, and the Merida initiative in Mexico. These are hundreds of millions of dollars invested in reducing the supply of coca as a raw material to produce cocaine. Now, the development sort of approach, the carrot, it's framed mainly by what we call alternative development. This is mainly substituting the coca plant by licit products, cacao, corn, and other licit products offered to campesinos growing coca. The more military and sort of criminal perspective or approach to reducing illicit crops, such as the coca one, sort of materializes with the detection and destruction of these crops, and many times using a very, very harmful herbicides as glyphosate being spread over those fields. My main argument is that these policies and tactics to eradicate coca do not account really for conditions of poverty, multidimensional poverty of thousands of those families that depend on the illicit market or illicit production. And on the contrary, increases violence in those very marginalized communities. There are some demonstrated consequences of this approach. And let me name a few. First, there's an extremely lucrative global illicit cocaine market around the world. The eradication has been demonstrated that produces what we call the balloon effect. When you press the crops in one area, it grows in another area. What happens basically is that the agricultural frontier is expanded, thus deforestation happens, for instance, in the Amazon basin. Escalating crime, as I mentioned, in Mexico, violence, corruption, destabilization. Let's remember that Latin America is the most violent region in the world. 1 of 3 homicides in the world happens in Latin America. There are also other effects like disproportionate mass incarceration and even increasing human rights violations such as extrajudicial killings. Let me give you a very concrete and terrible example that happened right after the Colombian government signed a peace agreement with the FARC insurgency in Colombia. Just a few months after the peace agreement was signed in 2016, 3 or 4 months after, the first massacre that happened in Colombia was committed by the counter-narcotics police against a group of coca farmers in the framework of a forced eradication campaign. The tally of that operation was 9 peasants killed by police. Evidently, these actions are not protecting the life or health of those fellow citizens, as proposed by the conventions. According to researchers in Colombia, the homicide rate in overall has dropped in Colombia from 90 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants to almost 24 around the country. However, in those regions where forced eradication happens, the amount of homicides is still at the level of 50 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. So again, there is the question on who are we protecting with that effort of reducing coca as raw material to produce cocaine. Around the Andean region, at least 300,000 families live on the coca economy, both on the legal and the illicit one. And I'll refer to those differences later. In those territories, multidimensional poverty it's above 90%. And it's in these matters where I will argue that any regulatory model, any perspective must take into account and should sort of promote empathy to those communities that depend on that economy. Let me paraphrase Michael Taussig in his work on the Museum of Cocaine. For Taussig, forbidden things like cocaine transgress more standard moral codes. and the distinction that we use to make sense of the world go above all the conventional way that we tell stories. So the common narrative around Coca, it's not the sacred dimension, but the illicit dimension. Now let me go to a second dilemma, which I found much more complex to understand. It's more nuanced and still we face a challenge as promoting drug policy reforms. And this departs from the idea that indigenous peoples have tried to sort of distinct or separate, at least at the discourse level, the idea that the use of coca in the traditional and cultural dimension should be separated and distant from the cocaine trade. Evo Morales, former president of Bolivia, first cocalero, an indigenous president in the country, prompted the slogan, Coca, yes, not to cocaine. I would argue that the 9 essential elements of the plant it's also a way of sort of denying the identity of the plant. Let's remember that coca is also cocaine. The plant that is used to produce the cocaine, the substance, erythroxylum, the variety, contains between 0.3 to 0.9 of cocaine. On the other side of the spectrum, the more prohibitionist, conservative approach, the Colombian government, my government, has used also a slogan that says, "Do not cultivate a plant that kills." In a word game in Spanish that sort of says, "La mata que mata," the plant that kills. My argument is that both perspectives bring and are charged of stigma and are affecting not only the communities that depend on that cultivation, but also on the plant. The dilemma between the legal uses of coca and the illicit ones bring us to the following question, a question that I'd like us to respond later if we have time for Q&A. What about a regulated market of the coca leaf that includes the cocaine as one of its byproducts, considering obviously the cultural and traditional dimensions? Many indigenous organizations in Colombia oppose these efforts, oppose the idea of regulating the coca market that also allows mestizo farmers to profit from it. Many organizations, indigenous organizations, are also pushing back with the idea that they need to be consulted before the mestizo community, the campesino mestizo community, use it. So let's remember that there are 3 main Andean countries where coca leaf is produced for, again, the licit and the illicit market: Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia. And there are different levels of recognition of rights to the production and use of the plant as part of the cultural heritage. Let me refer back to the UN conventions. Remember that by 1986, the UN proposed that chewing of coca will be prohibited. Well, in response, in 1988, Peru and Bolivia requested that the need of distinction between the licit and the illicit cultivation, taking into account the legal traditional uses. Today, what we're seeing in the Andean region is the following: a different level of protection of the coca leaf to circumscribe basically to the cultural sphere. Let's see. The Colombian, again, the most conservative country in the region, reserves the right to cultivate coca only to indigenous peoples. In Peru, there is a national cocaine company, ENACO, which buys about 3,000 tons of coca a year and sells it to the legal and buys it to the legal market, from the legal market. And actually is the only country that makes transactions with cocaine. The case of Bolivia, I will say, deserves a special mention because at some point, heroically, withdrew from the single convention, the UN convention that I've been mentioning, in 2012 under Morales' administration, arguing the contradiction between definitions included in the convention, traditional uses such as chewing, and the cultural heritage. The following year, in 2013, Bolivia requests to entry to the convention with one reservation, that the ancestral dimension and indigenous practices of chewing is not criminalized. Now, this defense of Coca definitely has allowed to efforts to industrialize and research about alternative uses of the coca leaf within the existing legal framework. For instance, in Colombia, given the incipient legal framework that I've been mentioning, mainly indigenous organizations are the only ones that are allowed to cultivate, and they are the ones that have been pioneering industrialization in the country. Only until 2 or 3 years ago, the first permit was allowed to researchers to investigate about different uses of the coca leaf. Only until last year, a group of chefs are experimenting with the uses of coca, which is receiving opposition from those indigenous organizations that I've been mentioning. The Peruvian case, despite the state's monopoly on purchasing the coca, there is a medium-sized business sector that offers different products derived from coca, edibles, and other nutraceuticals that are offered mainly to a tourist market. In Bolivia, industrialization has gone a bit further. State companies have are in charge of industrializing the uses of coca. There are many applications to coca cultivation beyond the ancestral uses. They even produce their own soda drink, the Coca-Cola, which again, it's a play of words on the multinational by inserting the term that refers to inhabitants of the low-lying areas of Bolivia. All these efforts, to me, without a doubt, seek to dignify the plant. Are offering alternatives to the uses of coca beyond the cocaine market. They are explorations with the intention of making an agricultural commodity product of a viable economic option to those communities. However, and this is my argument, it's wrong to think that the licit market for coca leaf could absorb and compete with the production of what comes or what's offered to the cocaine market. So let me refer to what I think is a semantic dichotomy or a cacophony in this approach. The Bolivian vice minister of coca, there is one in Bolivia, and that's a major advancement, Dionisio Núñez in 2012, when they decided to withdraw and rejoin the conventions, said that, and I'm quoting, "We are going to reiterate that we are committed to both the protection of coca in the cultural dimension and to the prohibition and combat of the illicit production." Again, we see here the dichotomy of the only element where coca can exist is the cultural dimension, whereas the prohibitionist approach to one of its core elements, cocaine. I think that insisting on that dichotomy only fuels the existing very harmful policies. This allows foreign interests and governments to insert their interest in the reality of the coca grower and define what can be done and what cannot be done in our countries. So my question or my approach is how to offer a radical questioning of the normative and the policy framework that cannot be separated poorly done by reality. That is the reality that those who live out of the plant. Constructing a language in a difference between populations of cultivators generates only tensions, unreal distances between realities that are lived by campesinos mestizos and campesinos indigenous, vocations that have similar conditions throughout the region. To me, both perspectives are stigmatized. Both denies the context in which occurs coca cultivations and express laziness in policy, to say the least. An indication towards out of coca as part of the cocaine trade poses a real challenge to a massive community. Again, semantic constructions such as coca yes, cocaine no, had restricted the work in a more sort of common reality and looking for a common good. I insist that making that dichotomy between coca and cocaine in its cultivation dimension simplifies a very complex issue of inequality, multidimensional poverty, lack of rural development, and lack of state presence. The cacophony thus confronts history and unsatisfied rights of those communities. There's an illusion of a world without cocaine, and I believe that cacophony is fueling into that wrong idea. The tension that exists between ancestral coca and coca as cocaine does not contribute to reforming normative and political frameworks that we consider harmful. These are the cultivation of coca for ancestral uses and coca for cocaine, again, does not allow us to advance in an empathic dialogue between those communities. What is being a farmer, a coca farmer? That's one of the questions that I like to pose as well. What are they not subject to the same exclusions, indigenous and coca farmers, depending on the illicit market? And here is the main question to me from those tensions. Aren't they both farmers crushed by post-colonial history in positions coming from the global north? And here is something that I will really appreciate your thoughts on, which is basically how to avoid in a regulatory model to sort of replicate what has happened in the cannabis regulatory model, which is big industries, pharmas, and global north economies buying and absorbing industries that have profited from exclusion of those traditional farmers. I'll give you a very concrete example on what happened in Jamaica when they decided to regulate the cannabis market for the medicinal uses of cannabis. Most of the investment came from abroad. Cultivations were laid out, licenses were bought, and traditional farmers were left aside from those efforts. The same it's happening in Colombia and other parts of Latin America with the cannabis production. From 70 licenses that the Colombian government has offered to cannabis cultivators, only one is owned by an indigenous company. So again, the dilemma, the dichotomies, the tensions, not only between prohibition and regulation, but even within the uses, different uses of coca, it's allowing and giving space to the prohibitionist perspective as well as foreign interests to insert their agenda into our countries. I'd like to leave it there, and I like to sort of open up for questions and discussions.
Thank you so much, Diego. That was very interesting questions and some thoughts about the last question you posed, but I'll first pose a question that was put in the chat from Laura. She asks, what can be done to make it possible to separate the coca leaf from the cocaine powder and thus begin researching the benefits of the leaf worldwide, demystifying the prejudices? So I think there's a question about separating the two.
Right. And that's a good question because, again, that goes to my point, Ariel, of sort of denying the identity of the coca leaf. I mean, the coca leaf in its raw version, it's a mild stimulant, as coffee is, right? Now it's the chemical transformation that sort of transforms the coca leaf into cocaine that is pretty harmful to health in the way that's produced currently. Let me show you what I normally use to instead of coffee as the powder derived from the coca leaf. So this green powder is basically coca leaf, and you chew it and gives you sort of a mild stimulant. So separating cocaine from the coca leaf sort of loses that characteristic and identity. Now, the reality is also that there are many other uses, and we're experimenting and researching nutritional uses of coca to basically serve as to the culture. And that's an effort that still needs to be done. We need investment and research, but again, the prohibitionist framework has sort of limited the possibility to further research on the possibilities of coca.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because this is a conversation that comes up a lot, which is like the sort of good drugs and bad drugs and the inability to have nuanced conversations about many things. And I'm, just like we're comfortable if we can put things into the good and bad bucket. And I sort of was wondering, you mentioned that, and I'm curious, how do we get out of that sort of good-bad dichotomy and appreciate the multidimensional or the nuances? I mean, maybe it's education, but I'm very curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Let me share sort of answer from an anecdotal perspective. When I started working for, I was amazed, not to say shocked, to see that a very progressive foundation working drugs were okay with the traditional uses of coca, but they were very they had a very stigmatized perspective on those same farmers that were producing coca for the illicit one. So again, the idea was these are the good indigenous, the Levi-Strauss, good savage perspective, and there are the farmers that only work for the Pablo Escobar, right? Only if you know the realities on the ground, only if you go outside and talk to the farmers and see that there is no distinction on their daily lives, understand that an integral, responsible legal framework should be offered to all that can absorb their possibilities. And Ariel, you should know that by working with the cannabis industry, right? The way that sort of the cannabis industry has outlined, especially on the farmers and the production, it's left aside many traditional farmers. So only understanding the reality from the rural development perspective, we can sort of over binary approach that we normally have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm quite curious to go into the conversation about regulations. And you mentioned there was a permit on research, and there's a question in the chat about whether there are still medicinal uses for cocaine. I'm curious to hear more about what sort of regulation is being discussed, who's behind those regulations, and then I thought we could talk about regulatory models or examples in cannabis as well.
There's still, when I refer to Peru being the only country that actually makes international transactions with cocaine, it's still used for especially for small dental uses. So it's a small amount. I think that the amount that it's exported cocaine is around 70 tons or something around that sort. It's not big, to be honest. But that's the only sort of exception that to Peru. Now the regulation should begin, and let me see some of these farmers that are still producing coca for the illicit market. The reality is, Ariel, that the current market doesn't absorb the coca that's being produced at such a large scale. There are around 300 to 400,000 hectares of coca being produced in the Andean region, something that surpasses very much what's the illicit market can absorb.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you had mentioned also that there were indigenous organizations who didn't want regulations or who at least wanted to be consulted in the process. And I was curious to hear more about that. And I'll just say that, specifically, I can speak to California and what happened with tribes in California who were not consulted on the regulatory system. The laws were passed and they still are excluded. And so I hope very much that there is an effort to include indigenous people in that discussion. Can you speak more to the different groups and kind of who's showing up at the table and what the political policy-making moment looks like?
That's again a good question. Coincidentally, the first ever bill that pretends to regulate coca and cocaine as a byproduct. It's been discussed right now in the Colombian Congress, and that has received a lot of criticism from those indigenous groups that have used coca traditionally. Why? Again, because they haven't been consulted. And I think that sort of poses a challenge and a dilemma. Do we need to advance, and we want to advance on regulating the coca and cocaine market, or do we want to be inclusive enough and wait until we consult with indigenous to get their input? I think I see the benefits of the current bill. It doesn't have many chances, to be honest, but at least it's posing the discussion into the public arena.
We have a couple more questions in the chat, so I'll pose those. From Sarah, what do you think about the recent bill passed by Iván Marulanda in Colombia about coca leaf and its derivatives?
Yeah, that's exactly the bill that I was referring to. I think it's a very comprehensive bill. Actually includes those farmers that I've been referring to, the farmers that are mestizo farmers, around 200 in Colombia living out of the production of coca for the illicit market, as well as outlines responsible harm reduction. I saw in the chat that they were mentioning harm reduction sort of approaches to the use of cocaine. But again, it has received input from civil society experts and researchers, but we're not there yet. I see the bill failing in Congress, but at least it's igniting the debate.
Mm-hmm. Celeste asked, what about narco-traffic related with government administrations of many countries, also related with human trafficking? There's so much involved besides market regulation. What do you think of this?
Thanks. I really appreciate that question. Because there's also, we shouldn't fall for the false promise that regulating drug markets, especially the cocaine market, we will reduce violence in Latin America. I mentioned that Latin America is the most violent region in the world. 1 of 3 homicides happening in the region, around the world happens in Latin America. But the reality is that drug trafficking organizations, only drug trafficking organizations, that they have sort of expanded their portfolio, let's say, of illicit economies. Human trafficking, wild fauna trafficking, timber, gold mining, illegal gold mining. Obviously, regulate the cocaine, sort of scratch those finances, but I don't see that as the silver bullet to solve the violence emanated from organized crime in the region.
Fidel asked, thoughts on how work like yours, for example, on decriminalization, can collaborate and connect with struggles for prison and police abolition. The war on drugs and the prison industrial complex are international.
I fully agree. I mean, one of the research that we have supported has found that the best well-founded police unit in Latin America are that are trained and use the supply of Coca as the raw material. Let me give you a concrete example. The cost to eradicate a hectare of Coca using glyphosate aerially costs around $25,000 versus the cost of reducing Coca production by offering those farmers alternatives, which is around $10,000. So again, if we compare those amounts to effort abolitionism and police reform, facing massive challenges of lobbies and strong sort of policy advocates that profit from these sort of prohibitionist and punitive.
Yeah. So I'd love to come back to the discussion or the question you asked at the end about how to avoid regulatory models like cannabis, where big companies squash small farmers, and just kind of offer some thoughts, and maybe you and I could have a bit of a discussion about this. I think, you know, what I've noticed, and I've been involved in drug policy reform and specifically in California for 15 to 20 years, actively so. And I have worked over the years with a lot of small farmers and certainly watched kind of the, you know, change in law and the impact that's had. And if only I knew back then what I know now. I'll just offer a couple things, and I'm curious what you think about any of this, where it might land. You know, it was wonderful to hear your discussion, because going back to the idea of certain people are good and certain people are bad. The illicit market is bad, and it was, you know, I will not use this term, but, you know, even termed the black market. You know, there's racial connotations to this. There's,
Totally.
You know, for people who are in difficult circumstances financially, whatever the case may be, or just being kind of traditionally from families of cannabis farmers. And but this effort during the process of legalization to create the good camp under the rule of law, basically. Right. I think we're less sort of obsessed and interested in laws being and that which the government says is the best thing. We seem less interested in that these days. So I hope that from the outset, that a more nuanced conversation can come about from work like yours and people who are really thinking about drugs in a very different way. And then, you know, it's why I asked the question about Indigenous people and who's involved in these discussions now, because it is really those moments and you know, is it equity first? Is it Indigenous reciprocity first? Are we taking the time to have involved conversations, or is there a rush toward regularization and commercialization and commodification?
Right.
So that's, I'm curious about what you're seeing on that front.
Well, I think that the challenge is there, and for instance, the current bill lacks that consultation process, and again, those rights, uses, and dimensions should be acknowledged, considered, and protected, and not left aside, because those are the ones that are at danger as well, as we saw with the UN Convention, as I was mentioning. The chewing of coca was proposed to be eradicated in 25 years, a millennial sort of tradition, right, and practice, and that's still there. However, well, my point there is that we should sort of approach this issue from a more nuanced perspective, as you're saying, understanding that the mestizo campesino community living out of this economy, and we need to offer solutions to them. And if we were to see a regulated market, they should profit from it as well. They should be included in whatever sort of model, responsible model we see on cocaine production.
And we have, I think, one final question. What are the biggest challenges you see around legalization, decriminalization in Colombia?
The decriminalization, it's actually, and that's probably not well known around the world, decriminalization of cocaine use passed in 1994, thanks to the Constitutional Court. So drugs are decriminalized in Colombia. You're allowed to carry up to 2 grams of cocaine. Well, then is police corruption, and it relates, it pertains to the previous questions on police reform. But let's not go that route. What I'll say is that we're still facing a very conservative, moralistic society, pretty disinformed. And the more reactionary sectors are using what we see today, which is instigating fear amongst the society, which again connects, for instance, coca production in all its forms to violence directly. Something that we have proved that is impossible to connect. Again, the same way that by regulating coca and cocaine, we wouldn't be able to reduce violence directly. The same way coca and cocaine production doesn't produce violence the same way as governments are saying. So as for now, what we need to do is sort of decriminalize those farmers, de-stigmatize their practices, and approach them from a more humanistic development.
Thank you. Well, that is all the time we have. So I think we've got to sign off. Thank you so much, Diego. It's so wonderful to hear from you. Everyone very much appreciates your comments, and I wish you very well and hope to see you again at the next Chacruna conference.
Yeah, in person, hopefully. Ariel, yes, thank you very much. Thank you. Gracias a todos y a todos. Adiós.
Adiós.